All right, so welcome back to the second part of the Spring Web Flux video. So in this tutorial, in this video, we're simply going to create our Spring web client. So the web client, we're going to use it to fetch data from our Spring Web Flux API that we just created. If you haven't watched the video, just quickly go ahead and watch the first video. But for the most part, you can always go ahead and start from this one. So what we're going to do is just go ahead and head to Spring.io and put and fill out, put the name of your packages. So this one I'm simply going to call it Spring Web Client, right? So this is going to be a Spring Web Client project, and then for the dependencies, I need Lombok, I need Flux, so I need the reactive web, right? So remember, the Spring Web Client, it comes with this Spring reactive web, right? So just like the one that we used to actually create the Spring Web Flux, so it also comes with the Spring Web Client, right? So once you have your dependencies ready, just go ahead and hit generate. Just generate. So you just generate, right? So once you have generated your repository, just quickly go ahead and jump to your Spring project. So inside the Spring project, what we want to create a RESTful web client service that will be able to fetch data from our web flux service. So I'm simply going to create my package. So the first package that I'm going to create is called controllers. Then I'm going to create another one, right? Another one called services, right? So these are the only two packages that I'm going to have, right? So the first thing that we probably need to do is, if you go to resources, applications properties, just quickly go ahead and change the server port, because if you don't change, remember the first Spring Web Flux that we created, the service that we're going to query is on 8080. So this one I'm just going to put it on 8081. Right, so inside the service, let's just go ahead and create a class. So this class, I'm going to call it web client service. So for me to be able to get data from the Spring Web Flux that we just created, I'm going to use this service. So the first thing, I'll annotate this service with Spring Web Service. Then I'll simply go ahead and create a variable code. So I initialize our web client, right? So in this case, we're going to use the web client, and I'm going to do like this. Then in my constructor, so it's probably complaining about the constructor. So in my default constructor, I'm simply going to initialize the web client. So from the way I'm going to initialize the web client, I'm simply going to say, so I'm going to initialize it from the web client.builder. So I'm going to say web client.builder is equals to web client builder, right? So once you have this, then we initialize the web client. So we're going to say initialize it from the web client builder. Then we we'll put the base URL. So in this case, we're simply going to fetch our data from the Spring Web Flux that was created. So it's going to run, that one is running on port 8080, and then it has a it has a base URL called API, then .build. Right, so once you initialized your web client, let's now go ahead and create our fetch methods, right? So the first one that I'm going to create is going to be find all users, right? So I'm simply going to say public. So remember, the find users was returning a flux of users, right? So in this case, I'm going to say find users, right? Like so. So we probably need to create the DTO for our users. So let's go ahead and create a new package, right? So inside this package, I'm simply going to call it DTO. Then I'm going to add a Java class which I'm going to call users. Then inside this Java class, it's going to be a data DTO, and then I'm simply going to use Lombok to put my default constructor and my 9 default constructor, and then the data for my accessor methods. So once I have that, so I'll simply go ahead and say private string. So we're going to have name, right? So for my data, I have name. So let's copy this. So I have name, surname. So this is just the DTO email that we're going to use to get our response or to post stuff. Email, maybe username, maybe password. Probably don't need it, but so once we have your DTO already, so our DTO is going to be called users. So when I'm going to fetch the data, I'm going to so for example, find all users is going to return a response of type users, right? So it's going to be a stream of users. So, and it's going to be a flux, right? So the way you do it in Spring Web Client, you just say return this dot, then you get your instant web client that we just created, and then you use the get method. So this is going to be a get request. So this is how you do it. So you say web client dot get to annotate that this is going to be a get request, then you put your endpoint, right? So since we already initialized, we had already built our base URL here, we simply want to hit, so it was /API then /. So for the users, if you still remember, it was /users, right? So we're simply going to get all users from http localhost 8080 /API /users, right? So this is going to be a get request. So the next thing that you need to do is to now get or to now subscribe to the information, or to now get the response from our service or from our HTTP request. We're going to use a method called retrieve, right? So the retrieve, what it does is it actually gets the stream of data, right? Then once we have the stream of data, we now want to actually return the body of that data. So to access the body, you say body. So in this case, since it is a flux of stream of data, you simply say body to flux, like so. And then for our class, for our response type, it's going to be a stream of data of type users, right? So what we simply expect is to get a list of data of type users from this endpoint. So this is how we do it. So this is our get request. So our get request is now done. Then the next one that we want to do is want to also do a get request, for example, the find by user, find by ID. So for the find by ID, again, I'm simply going to say find user by ID. So for the find user by ID, I'm simply going to pass the long. So for the mono, let's simply go ahead and import the mono, and then we simply want to return. So again, we call our instance web client, right? So web client dot it's a get request. Then the endpoint for find user by ID, it was user / we pass the ID, right? Once you pass the ID, then you need to pass the actual ID here. So this is just the endpoint, so we are going to pass this ID field to those curly braces. So, and again, you use retrieve to subscribe with the data, and then we use, so in this case, since we're going to return a single instance, it's going to be body to mono, right? So you say body to mono like this, and then the user is going to be, the return type is going to be of type user, right? Our object, our DTO that we just initialized. So once you have this, then that's it. Then, so you probably see that. So for the most part, this is just pretty basic. It's almost similar to what we did on that on this Spring Web Flux service. only that the only difference that is there is you're now using a web client to hit that endpoint, and then the only difference are these two. But in terms of the pattern and how the data is going to be retained, it's just going to be the same. So by using this Spring Web Client, you are guaranteed that you're getting data that is reactive, that is non-blocking, right? Because you'll be subscribing the data in a non-blocking way using Web Client. So the next endpoint or request that we want to do is we want to hit maybe the save user, right? So for the save user, if you still remember from our web client, for the save user, so if I simply go ahead and go to the save user from that other service, you can actually see that for the save user, it was returning a void, right? So the way we handle it, right? So if it's returning a void, so in this case, it's not probably the best way to do it, but because you'd want maybe to return a meaningful response rather than a status, right? So if you want to return a void, so in this case, we simply want to return the status response, right? So in this case, what we want to do here is, in terms of the response type, we're going to return a mono. Then this mono is going to be of type client response, right? Then I'm simply going to say save user, right? So the user that we're going to save is, we're going to use our DTO again, and then you say return this dot web client. So it's going to be this dot web client dot post, right? So we're going to write a post request to our service, right? Then the endpoint was /save, right? So once you hit the post, right, the next thing that you simply, since it is a post request, right, remember our service accepts the JSON, right? So the media type is going to be application JSON. So for our header, we are simply going to pass our HTTP headers. So I'm simply going to say HTTP headers from the Spring Web flag, from the Spring itself. Then the content type, we are simply going to say, okay, for the content type, we're going to use the media type dot application. So it's dot application dot JSON, right? So we're simply going to post the JSON. Then for the body, right? So for the body, the next parameter is the body. So for the body of our request, right, we simply want, so everything is reactive, right? So simply want to pass a mono, right? Then in terms of the object that we're going to pass, or the JSON object that we're going to pass, it's going to be of type mono. And then for you to get that single instance of that object, use the just method in the mono. So the just method is we want to pass the user, this user that we were passing here. So simply want to pass that user. So we say user, like so. And then so in terms of the response type that we get from the body, it's going to be users dot class, right? So once you do this, so since it was returning a void, so instead of retrieving, because here we don't want to write, we're not expecting to get a meaningful JSON response, it's just going to be the status. So we simply use the exchange, right? So you simply say exchange, right? So what this does is it will simply return a response, right? So in that case, it was created, the HTTP created response. So the next one that we want to look at is the update user, right? So we're going to say update. So remember, for the update user, it was returning, so once you update the user, it was returning a response of type mono. So this one, I'm simply going to call it update user, like so. Then in terms of the user that we're going to pass, it's going to be of type user, the DTO. Then you say return this dot web client dot. So this one is going to be a put request, right? So remember, for update, it's going to be a put request. So we say put, then we, for our URL, our endpoint that we're going to hit, it was going to be update, right? And in terms of, so since it's going to be a put request, you need to put the header and then the body, right? So I'm simply going to copy this, right, from our post request, right? So simply we'll simply tell our web client that it's going to be application JSON for the header, and then for the content type, and then the body is going to be of type user. And then remember, this is going to return a mono of type user, so we need to use the retrieve method again. Then you subscribe to the data, so in terms of, we say body to mono, and then it's going to be of type users, right? And then we'll pass our DTO as a class. So this is the response type, right? So once you do this, this is going to be your update request, right? So we are done with the update service, right? Then the last one that maybe you probably need to look at is the delete user, right? So for the delete user, it's going to be public. So remember, for the delete user, it was going to return a void. So we'll simply say mono of type void, then delete user, right? So for a delete user, we're going to pass an ID, right? And then we're simply going to return this dot web client dot is going to be a delete request. Then we're going to pass the URI, and it's going to be of user. I'm not quite sure if we had created this endpoint, but it's fine. You guys can actually go ahead and create it if we didn't create it. Then retrieve, then body to mono. It's going to be of type void, right? Like so. Right, so this is how you do your delete request. So once you have got your service ready, it means we simply now want to create our controller, right? So that we'll be able to call this service. So for our controller, this is simply just a repetition. So I'm simply going to create our web client controller. So I'm simply going to say web client for the class, right? So I've created a class called web client controller, and then this class, I'm going to annotate it with address controller, like so. So once you have annotated it like that, the first thing that you need to do, this is just like what we did before. We're simply going to inject our web client service that we just created. So it's going to be web client service, right, like so. And then you need to start writing our your endpoints, right? So for this one, I'm going to say request mapping. So in this case, for this one, I'm simply going to put it a base URL of web, right? And then in terms of the data itself, right, I'm simply going to go ahead and grab the data, right? So let me try to grab the data. So for the data, I'm simply going ahead and just for endpoints, I'm simply go ahead and paste these endpoints that I just wrote. So let me just import the classes and then I'll just explain it shortly. So this is just the same like what you did when you create the RESTful service, the WebFlux RESTful API. So I'm simply going to import a few classes like so, and then I import my Flux. All right, so what we simply did here is, so for our controller, we are going to put a base URL of web, and then for our get request, so remember, for get request, it was user slash ID from our web service, from our web client, right? This is the get request that so this is the endpoint that we're going to hit. Then once we hit the endpoint, it is simply, so for example, get by ID, it will call the service, that the web client service that we just created, and then this web client would then query a request to our service. Then it will get the mono data, the single object, the user. Then for our users, again, for our users, it will do the same thing. It's going to return a text event stream. Then it's going to hit our web client service, find users. Then the find users will then query the request to our service. Then it will return a stream of data, right? So remember, here there was a 2 seconds delay, so we're expecting to see it, right? Because nothing is blocking, everything is non-blocking. Then in terms of the response, it's going to say accepted. Then for a save, again, we're simply going to call the save, and etc. So for the most part, this is just the same controller, like the way we did it when we created our Spring Web Service, right? So the last thing that we probably need to do for this, we are probably done with our web client, right? So this is the web client. So you can actually see that the web client is simple to understand. It's straightforward. There's nothing much. The learning curve is just instant, just like that. You don't need to go deeper into learning this, but there are a few advanced things that maybe you can go ahead and learn. Like, it's not advanced, but just some basic things. Like, for example, if you want to put some timeouts, so for example, let's say this is an invert stream, you can put a timeout. So by default, I think the timeout is around 30 seconds. So if you put, so for example, you can test and put data that will take more than 30 seconds to return. You should be able to see the timeout exception, right? So let's simply go ahead and run our endpoint, right? So remember, this one is going to run on port 8081, I mean. All right, so our web client is started on port 8081 and it's using Netty, which is good. So let's simply go ahead and write some kill requests. So this one is going to be http localhost 8081/web/ let's say users, right? So this is going to get, so this our service is going to query the other service. So you can actually see that it returns the stream of data, right? So if you want to get let's say user, then user number 2, right? Like so, it has returned the user number 2, right? So you can actually see that for the most part, our endpoint is working. And for the most part, this is how you use your Spring Web Flux. So I'm not going to test the save update. You guys can actually go ahead and test it out because I understand that this video has already been pretty long, more than I expected. So thank you guys for watching. This is how you create your Spring Web client. If you have any questions, just make sure to comment down below. I'll make sure that I'll try to answer all your questions. And if you have suggestions of future videos that you will want to see, just let me know in the comment down below. So for the last part segment of this series of Spring Web Flux, the last segment, we're simply going to compare Spring Web Flux versus the Spring MVC that we're all used to. So we're simply going to use the JMeter to actually go ahead and compare the two web frameworks and see the advantages that Spring Web Flux has over Spring MVC. So Spring Web Flux is not yet perfect. I don't encourage you to actually go ahead and like change your giant projects in Spring MVC to Spring Web Flux, because like for example, there's few trade-offs that you need to take care of, for example, in terms of managing your entities, managing your schemas, and etc. But it's actually a pretty good initiative that you can actually go ahead and use it for if you have small projects and etc. So in our last video, we're going to compare the two web frameworks, and then that should be it. Thank you so much guys for watching. Don't forget to like, to subscribe, and to share the video. See you in the next one.